welcome to Echoes, a sumo podcast, history podcast. I'm Nathan, and I am one of the main researchers for this project. And I will hand it over to Jake to introduce himself too.
Yeah, I'm Jake from Iowa Sumo Club and Grand Sumo Breakdown. I'm a huge sumo fan and history fan, so I am here to learn about both. I'm very excited for this project. It's been a lot of fun getting it started so far. I'm excited to get into the real narrative of everything.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
And
JJ?
I am JJ Jones, the Honu Sumo dude, the guy that constantly puts his foot promptly into his mouth and kind of generated this whole thing. And I think that I am literally the luckiest dude ever because I surround myself by greatness. And these two up here are pretty great.
So what are we doing here?
Yeah. So
I appreciate you, JJ.
Yeah, I'm really fortunate. I was actually telling somebody today about how cool it is that that we're using the history of sumo in America as kind of this like core sample. And as we're finding all kinds of other interesting stories, you guys are on board with going like, yeah, let's tell that story instead of it being a distraction.
Mm-hmm.
So this project, we have another episode really explaining about why we did it. But basically, short version is, as we started digging into the history of early sumo in America, we found it goes way back further than we thought it did. So this episode, we're going to start telling that story of how sumo came to America, at least by the mid 1920s. And we're going to start telling that story, and we're going to have a bunch of future episodes talking about American sumo's connection to sumo in Japan, and like a transition from first generation to second generation Japanese Americans, what happened to those important people in sumo during World War II, and then kind of what happened to sumo after World War II. So it's going to be a big story. We're just scratching the surface, and we've found enough stories already to do a series now, and I think we got enough to do future series. So I'm super excited about this.
It reminds me of the first time I got into sumo in general, where it's like, oh, neat, this is a cool athletic sport. And then suddenly I'm 3 hours deep in Wikipedia, and it's just a rabbit hole that keeps on going, and there's new branches of everything. And it's so cool to see how somebody that knows what they're doing for research, not just, like I said, the Wikipedia rabbit holes, like there's so much stuff out there that's not on the surface. And I think that this project is, even the limited start that we've got so far has been like, this is too much to handle in one sitting. This is going to be a big old thing.
Yeah. I mean, we were like, oh yeah, like it started off as like, let's meet with our local historical society, and like I'll do a little prep for it. And I started like digging on some
and we'll do 4 or 5 episodes of a podcast, right? Yeah. And then suddenly,
yeah, it's gotten big, but in a good way. Like it's I think we found some threads, and I like that we're going to tell the stories we can, and each one is an invitation for people to find more, us to find more, and we can keep fleshing out the story. So there's plenty there. So it's really cool. So a couple things I just want to get out there right away is that we're still just scratching the surface. And right now, what we're looking at is mainly English language sources in America. There's whole sections of like Japanese American newspapers that are in Japanese. So like my Japanese reading and writing is like really minimal right now. So there's more there. This is just looking at the English language stuff.
Yeah. So like there's the surface level of like Googleable Wikipedia stuff. There's the level that we're at now. We've dug one level deeper, and then there's like the real meat of everything that hopefully we'll get more and more of as we go on. But like,
yeah, well, and I think there's even like a layer below that, and there's a couple of the stories that we get to later that kind of get into there, which is kind of cool.
It's tough when like my Japanese is, I know a select number of sumo terms, and I know how to apologize. I'm a foreigner, sumimasen, gaijin desu.
Yeah.
That's like the extent of it. So like there's so much out there that we can get as we expand our resources in this.
Yeah. And I think like the one risk just as like a storytelling thing is it can get weirdly like meta. There's like one episode later that it's totally just going to be like, here's my research process, but it was a cool story, emotional roller coaster.
Cool. Okay.
But as like a chronological narrative, nah, but it's kind of meta, but it's a cool story. And I'll take you guys on that journey. But this one is a bit more kind of chronological, just telling the story of how sumo started coming to America. And a lot of the sources on this come from a cool resource called the Hoji Shimbun collection. And so it's like Stanford University's Hoover Institution has this digitized collection of Japanese and Japanese American newspapers. And so like you punch in sumo and there's like 6,500 results.
That's what I like to hear.
Yeah. And so then it's like, oh, what am I going to do with that? And right away, one of them is like, all right, Hawaii has enough that's going to be a whole own series. Like Hawaii, and as we go through this whole thing, right, like Hawaii is such a big thing that's going to have to be its whole own thing. So Hawaii, viewers in Hawaii, if you raise your hand, you're like, but Hawaii. It's like, yeah, we know. Like,
oh
Hawaii. Yeah. and not just like from the, Takamiyama, 60s era, like going way back. And so there's that. So the Hoji Shimbun collection is a great resource that like a lot of this stuff has come from. And then the Japanese American National Museum has been like a great help, and they have a lot of pictures online, and they've shared some stuff with us too. And then the other thing, especially for this episode, that's like a cool, like a book reference that was really influential for me. I would have loved to been able to get the author as like a guest, but he wasn't available. Is this book called Between Two Empires by a professor at University of Pennsylvania named Eiichiro Azuma. And it's about this like identity issues of like Japanese American communities, like on the mainland, especially California, between like the teens through 30s. So that's a great like resource that kind of has been great. I read that book and it's really I recommend it to anybody who kind of wants some context on this.
Side note, we should make sure that at the end of this first run of the project, we should summarize the resources so people can like a book, a reading list or something for people to go after.
Yeah, that'd be real nice.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Yeah. So kind of where sumo starts in America is obviously with Japanese people coming to America. And most Japanese people started coming to America starting around like the mid 1900s, so like 1905, the Russo-Japanese War, and they start coming to America. Some of them had been in like the military, had done military service during that time. Some were draft dodgers probably, but that happens. And people started coming here to America often as kind of migrant farm workers, but there was also people starting to go spread out of Japan as part of this like bigger movement of kind of, it's not quite like Japanese colonialism, but it's this planting Japanese influence and connections and trade around the world. So there's these like different classes and motivations for people going, but the majority of people were going as like migrant workers. And one of the things that's been interesting is like in like some oral histories I've seen and stories is a lot of people came through Hawaii first. And JJ, could you pull up the slideshow? We have a couple pictures that start kind of showing some of that stuff.
Hey everyone, JJ here in the Echo Chamber, a Chamber of Echoes, a Sumo History Podcast. So the nonprofit that we're doing for this one is one that it feels like everything that we're researching kind of repeats, right? Some would even say it echoes of the past. The nonprofit that we're doing is the UnitedWeDream.org, with certain leadership in the country. It's always important to remember the roots of America, and we are a country of indigenous people that were, unjustly taken over and such. But after that, we were all immigrants. Some of us by choice, some of us not by choice. But ultimately, it's we are all immigrants, and there should be ways for people to be able to stay with their families. Go ahead onto their website. Their website is right here. And if you have any spare cash, anything along those lines, please donate. I think that everything that we're doing and everything that we see, just it's I'm not even trying to be funny, but it does have echoes, like legitimately echoes of the past. So this one's kind of a bummer, but they're a just cause. Give some cash, unless it puts you into an uncomfortable burden, financial burden. So again, it's United We Dream. Thank you.
So this first picture is Imperial Japanese, I think it's like Navy cadets at a sumo tournament. And, there's a gyoji, they're, wrestling. And so this is, that early kind of exposure of sumo for a lot of people who ended up coming to America, like while they were in the military or in their, hometowns in Japan.
Is this picture is in Japan though? This is
So this one, I'm not sure. Like the labels of it aren't clear about whether this is in Japan.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not clear. Later, actually, it gets to something that's a pretty common thread throughout this whole era, is that when like Japanese Imperial Navy like training ships came to America and were in port at like San Pedro or San Diego or San Francisco or Seattle, there'd often be like a welcoming picnic, and there'd usually be a sumo tournament accompanying it.
Cool.
So there was this kind of thing of, these Japanese cadets coming to America. So this could be in America. It's an American family that donated, like a Japanese American family that donated this picture and had it digitized. But I don't know if this is Japan, Hawaii,
sure,
in America. I don't know.
It's very clear though that it's it's like casual sumo. Like it's not the Ozumo that was already going and was already an institution at this point. This is, on some level, this is regular folks having fun.
Yep, exactly. And, like I think of it as like community sumo, but community sumo is like whether it's school sumo, amateur sumo or whatever. It's just, people doing it as part of like some bigger event. And there's so much of that in these newspapers that I stopped even recording them. I basically just been like, okay, this just keeps happening and it doesn't end. Like,
look, another one. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just, there's dozens of them.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think that I don't know, the equivalent might be like if the US Navy is doing something and they stop off at a base for a while.
Yeah.
Young kids are going to want to do young kids. God, we're old. 20-year-olds are going to want to do 20-year-old stuff. Right. So like,
it's like in Afghanistan, them playing football.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or boxing or whatever, like a Western sport, just because that's what they know and that's how they let off steam and that's how they have fun. Because I don't know if you guys know this, but in the military, you're bored a lot. So combat sports is certainly a big hobby, I know, among everybody that I've known in the military.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a thread like starting from the very, very beginning. And it's clear from some of the people who are like leaders and like first generation leaders in sumo clubs that's a thread. Like they're often also members of like like Japanese veterans organizations and stuff like that.
Sure.
So that's a thing that kind of carries all the way through. So then like a lot of folks, especially like the more working class, like farmers and farm workers went through Hawaii. And there's a few like oral history things that make specific reference, like interviewing. There's this one woman, Mrs. Fujimoto, who lived who lived up in the Northern California. area, and she was talking about how her dad was like really influential in the sumo club in their town, and how he'd really gotten into sumo not necessarily in Japan but in Hawaii on his way over. So a way for these young migrant farm workers to have fun, or if they had a weekend, like a long weekend, that they do sumo. And then when he came to America, he was like, I mean, mainland US,
Sure.
he was totally into sumo. And so this picture is from Hawaii, and this is one of the earliest pictures in like an American territory of sumo. It's like in the 1910s, and it's in Hilo, Hawaii. And no relation, my friend Sharon Fujimoto, who writes children's books about the Japanese American experience, her like great grandfather was like a big sumo booster in Hilo, Hawaii around this time. So
Cool.
when she was telling me that, I was like, oh, you got to see this picture. So anyway, we're sharing pictures.
Classic America, though. It's more than 100 years ago, and they're already wearing shorts under their belts.
Puritan values. Puritan values.
Unbelievable.
Yep, it starts right away. It's and you do see it like throughout the pictures later. And some of the earliest pictures I saw from like in the concentration camps of sumo happening, people wearing shorts. I was like, is that because this is going to be like a Life magazine picture spread? I don't know. But seeing the other pictures, I was like, no, people were wearing shorts before that and just doing sumo. So yeah. So this thread starts coming over, and then what's really interesting and both frustrating and super intriguing is then when I'm looking at like the English language sections of these newspapers and looking at pictures, there's not a lot until like the mid 1920s.
Sure.
So, but what's so intriguing is there's clearly like sumo already been happening. It's just suddenly like it's making the papers and people are organizing. So there's just like this shift that happens, but the sumo was happening even before that. So like what that transition was, I have some ideas. And I think it was kind of a combination of some things, but I'm not 100% sure. So I think the next picture does show one of the earliest pictures of sumo just kind of happening in a community.
Cool.
So this
is sorry to interrupt.
No,
that's one thing that I've heard a lot in pop history stuff. Like I don't know, one of the what do you call it, gateway drugs to history as a hobby is obviously Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast, right? And one of it's incredible. I love it. But one of the things he brings up all the time is that it's one of the common difficulties in studying history is that like people today, if somebody was looking 200 years from now back on today and they were like, what's a garbage truck? Like, it like gets mentioned here and there, but it's just so much a part of life that like, maybe there's very little actual surviving history on what is a garbage truck. Yep. Why don't people have garbage vaporizers within their home or something like we do 200 years from now, right?
Yeah.
Or whatever it is. But like, that transition from there's nothing to we're talking about sumo because it's already a thing.
Yeah.
And that can be a frustrating thing throughout history. But if it was just happening because people do it as a hobby, why would they bother writing about it? Like, it's not, people don't go about their daily lives thinking about posterity in all of the emails they send or all of the newspaper articles they write. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Retention policies
and I bet you a lot of stuff happened with word of mouth, and like, in the future, we don't know if our internet data will be around, even though we
sure.
send it all out. Right.
Yeah.
It's not permanent.
I just hope at least one person is looking at like, what was sumo in America like in the 2020s? And they happen across this. Like, I know I joked about it in another episode too, but like, man, I would love to strike gold of somebody in the 19 teens writing in some like California zine amongst Japanese immigrants or something about like, man, I know Nathan is just like chomping at the bit for something like that. But like if we came across something like that where somebody was doing it as a research project, that would be the best possible outcome.
Yep. Oh no, that would be fantastic and awesome. And No spoilers. No spoilers. All right.
I know it's hard because I know you've been
Oh, I'm
you've
excited.
at least started off on the outline for all of our episodes already, right?
Yeah. It's gotten a little crazy, but it's crazy fascinating. Like it's really
yeah.
cool. So I think one of the things that I think is funny about this picture is it's on the Facebook post of like a Salinas Asian, like I forget, I can't, the writing's too small and I'm old, but it's like a ACE. It's a like an Asian cultural institution in Salinas, and it's this picture of sumo happening in Salinas, Chinatown. So for people who don't know California, the Salinas Valley is this like major kind of agricultural area that's south of San Francisco, like in kind of central California, but on the coastal side. And now there's like it's farmland and prisons. That's all there is there. But sorry, I didn't mean to diss it, but it's a major agricultural area.
Our several listeners from that region are going to be so upset. They're going to write us a letter.
I know.
Way to go, Nathan.
Put your comments down there. At least I pointed the right direction at the time. So like in this Facebook post, they're like, hey, like what if we had sumo in Salinas, Chinatown again? And I'm like, there's people who could help you with that. So if anybody from this organization watches this, we saw your picture and we know people who could help you do that if you want to. So that's what the context of this picture is. But you know, like you could see from the tan lines on some of these guys that they're out in the sun. Like these are like working guys who they're doing sumo on, you know, on their time off, you know? So this is the earliest picture. It looks like it's like 1921, I think, is the date on it. Yeah.
Yeah, he's definitely the guy in the middle wearing the kesha mawashi, the extra elaborate apron he's got in front. He's doing some version of the Yokozuna dohyo iri, the Yokozuna traditional ring entrance. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I wonder something like that would certainly be a person who is interested in maintaining the tradition of sumo, not just the sport of it. And I know that like in Japanese culture, those are tied together a lot more than American sports and American culture consciously are.
Yep.
But yeah, I don't know. That's really cool. It looks like a very well captured moment that's got a lot going on here in this one picture.
Yeah, and it hints at that thing of like this is 1921, but there's a kesho mawashi, there's an audience, they have the wara, like it's
they have the two guys squatting next to him, which means those are his traditional two sword bearer.
Yeah, sword bearer and dew sweeper, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So like clearly there's some element of this, the individual in the middle is well regarded, an equivalent of a Yokozuna or the local champion or something along those lines. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Super cool.
Yeah. So it's just such a like window into like, oh, what was going on before this. So what's interesting is that then what really something happens in the mid 1920s, and there's several things. Like this is just my hunch, but in about 1926, the kind of writing about and pictures of sumo just take off. They just take off. And like my hunch is there's like three things. So this is kind of my thesis about what starts happening.
Sure.
The first is in 1924, there's a massive restriction on Japanese immigration to the US. And like just basically the doors, Asian immigration, non-white immigration, like in 1924, just the doors are shut. And so a lot of the first generation Japanese American, like, well, they're Japanese. Like, so basically the US formally declares you have no path to citizenship and no more of you can come. Like that's what the US says, basically, to everybody except Northwestern Europeans.
No idea what that's like. Absolutely zero parallels to any other time in history.
Yeah. So, right.
It's never happened before. It never happened again.
Or
it's crazy.
Nope.
Um,
We learned our lesson. Sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry. Go
right,
on, Nathan.
yeah, no echoes or
No.
history here.
Hey, there you go. There's your bingo card. We said the name of the show.
So yeah, so when this happens, like a bunch of Issei, so that's like the first generation of immigrants, they start like looking at like, do they have a future in America? And actually, there's a lot of them that leave. Like they go to Latin America, they go back to Japan, they go back to Japan, and then they like start businesses kind of connected to Japan and like South Asia and stuff like that. So there's actually
Nathan, can you clarify the generations and the terms?
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
No, yeah, that's fine. So because of this like strict immigration law that went into effect in 1924, there's like these really mostly clear cut like generational cohorts in early Japanese American history. So the Issei are the first generation, and most came to the US, most men came to the US around 1900 to 1920, about. There was like a 15-year period in there from like 1908 to like 1923 where then women were allowed to come over. And that was disturbingly basically as a, well, we don't want these Japanese men to have babies with any non-Japanese women because of anti-miscegenation laws and racism. So we'll let women come over in order so that they can make, purely Japanese babies. So yeah,
Another bias that has not happened before or since in American history, of course.
Right.
Ugh.
Or in the world.
Yeah. So in one of our companion episodes, AT really talks about their, I think grandmother coming over as a picture bride. So these are like a lot of times arranged marriages where women would come over, often like 10 to 20 years younger than the men they're coming over to marry. So a lot of the Issei women who come over in that like 1908 to 1923, 24 are a bit younger than the men. So like there's an Issei male cohort, then there's like an Issei female cohort. And because I thought this question might come up, I looked up the numbers, and like in about 1910, there were 7 Japanese American men for every 1 woman. By 1920, it was 2 to 1. And then the doors shut. So like even during this period we're going to talk about from now on, men outnumbered women in the Japanese American community probably about 2 to 1 until there started to be a second generation.
So, and then the second generation was called what?
Nisei.
Nisei.
Yeah, so Nisei. So second generation. And the Nisei are starting to be born as women start coming over in larger numbers in the 1910s. But I didn't know until I not only started doing this research, but actually like interviewed an expert on this. I didn't know, and that was an education for me, that by the time World War I comes around, still most Nisei were minors. Like most Nisei were children even by 1942, because the women were younger. So there'd be these, men in their 40s, 50s, 60s having children, and so there's this kind of clear cohort, and there's very few Sansei or third generation at the time of World War II, but there's some. And then, so most Sansei Japanese American are born in, around World War II, and then starting in the 50s and 60s.
Sure.
So most of what we're going to be talking about in this whole series are Issei and Nisei. So Issei and Nisei. And also for brevity, moving forward, I'll probably say Nikkei. That's another kind of term that is a term for the Japanese diaspora, like Japanese people living outside of Japan.
As a whole, not specific to generations or what have you.
Right. It's just, so if I just say Nikkei, like instead of Japanese American,
Sure.
It's especially in the context of this story, we're mainly going to be talking about like mainland US. So if I say Nikkei community, that's just for brevity's sake.
Things have certainly evolved over time, but like if we're talking first half of the 20th century, those are pretty communities that are more isolated than they are today, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's something that is really going to be an interesting part of the story as we come to later, especially the later episodes, as we talk about kind of the insularity of a lot of the Japanese American
Yeah.
communities. But one thing that Dr. Azuma's book, like Between Empires, he really talks about what a significant thing this 1924, kind of getting back onto that 1924 and its significance, is that the Japanese Americans who stayed in America uh, had to decide like how they were going to navigate life here, how they were going to form communities here, and if they're going to stay in America, but the country had explicitly said you can't become citizens, cannot become American. How were they like? What's their place here? What's their identity?
Sure.
And so I think that's one thing that it like contributes to the 1920s being this big time of like sumo organizing. Oh, thank you, JJ. So yeah,
I want to show this this cover. The cover is actually quite amazing, and I think that the name itself with this actual photo is it's the best thing I've ever seen, and I just wanted to share this.
That's so cool.
Yeah,
and for the price, it's not bad. It's $35.
Yeah.
Oh, thank God. Okay, I was looking in the middle of the window.
Paperback. Yeah. So it's not
for
not
the price of $325. It's really yikes. Wow. Yeah, I'm sure it's just like really hard to find first printings of books that aren't like, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a really good book. He's really insightful about this like period of like trying to decide how to fit in different kind of cultures and communities, and in opposition to things. Like, it's just really, really interesting. There's like a lot of interesting levels to this book. So that's a big thing that's happening. Like, how do we fit in America? How do we form community here? Like, we've decided to stay. So that's one thing. The other big thing that's happening is just like global sports organizing is just blowing up in the 20s. Like, just baseball, Negro League baseball, a lot of like the precursors to a lot of like football clubs in Europe and stuff like that. Real football, not American football. Sorry, I made a lot of American enemies right there.
Yeah,
sorry.
that's a fight we don't need to have on this podcast.
If you just say it with an accent, I feel like everybody's pleased.
Football. Yeah.
So yeah, sports organizing is going crazy. And then there's one other big thing that's important, that's specific to not just the Nikkei community, but the Japanese kind of global community, including in Japan, is that there's a new emperor. Emperor Hirohito becomes the emperor. The Showa emperor starts. He's young, he's healthy. His father was developmentally disabled. So therefore not a very assertive or charismatic emperor. So Hirohito becomes emperor, and it's a time of like Japanese kind of like feeling pride in Japan after this kind of different period. But what also happens is like during the Taisho period, it's called like a Taisho democracy. It's like the roaring 20s of Japan. And then with Hirohito like comes a lot of pride, but also like, fascism and imperialism in that era. So the Japanese American community is connected to that. Like, that's the Nikkei community is connected to that kind of conversation and identity about Japanese pride, Japanese racial pride, and kind of cultural practices and identity. So I think those three things really like lead to this explosion in sumo organizing that we start seeing in like 1926.
Yeah, I was gonna. I want to shout out Hardcore History one more time here, because I think my favorite hour of that podcast ever is what was his Supernova in the East, is his series on just the Pacific theater of World War II. Mm-hmm. But the first hour or so of episode 1 of that series kind of broad strokes covers Meiji Restoration period in Japan through the 20s to 30s. And so like there's so much. I mean, we're trying to summarize in like 5 minutes what he took an hour and history took 50, 60 years to cover, right? Yeah. So like all of its broad strokes covering covering things quickly, but like this idea that Japan beat Russia at a war in 1905.
Yeah.
And then Japan, as a militarized, industrialized power in the 20s, they start dipping their toes into the imperialism waters the way that, the Western Europe powers have. And that's culturally just super significant.
Yeah.
And I think that like that, the way that hardcore history covers that era is certainly better than anything we could do here, but I would highly recommend at least that period that leads from the idea of national pride, the Meiji era, the beginning of the Showa era, similar idea, but like that national pride can get out of control. And certainly far from the only example in history, but like that national pride can it's a drug that's easy to take too much of, I think was the analogy that Dan Carlin used there. And that affects every aspect of culture when you get too deep into that.
Yep.
He also had a really good way of talking about how the world felt. And so he talked about a lot of the newspaper articles and how they referred to Japan winning that war.
Yeah.
And I've seen some of those. He held back.
For sure.
Doesn't sound like something that hardcore history would do, but it was a lot more racial and racist and
oh god, yeah.
It was and these were like national newspapers, like British national newspapers.
Yeah. White people took that war very poorly.
Yes.
Just Western Europe, Europe as a whole, just took the idea that one of their people could get beaten by somebody that's not white, just blew their minds and made them go crazy to some extent. But regardless, like that, even the hardcore history version is super condensed because it's like, I got to cover this in 1 hour so that we can get to our actual topic, which is World War II. And here we're like doing the abbreviated version of sending you elsewhere to listen to an abbreviated version because we got so much else to cover too.
Yeah. Well, and we kind of got to do it at the same, don't have to do it, but, and I think the other thing that I haven't listened to that episode, but I think Dr. Azuma's like Between Two Empires is really good, is this like conversation between kind of white society and white supremacy in America and paranoia about rising Japan, how the Japanese, the Nikkei community was caught in between, and then what things they did, and that like the internal conversations. And I think the biggest thing is he does such a good job of telling the story from the present with, kind of current values and everything, but at the same time, like, not like all just through the prism of what came after it, like really painting the picture of how none of it was inevitable and people kept making choices that made sense to them at the time.
Right. Sure.
And on all sides, and that everybody was kind of a person of their time and navigating life, and people reacted to it, and then like none of them knew it was going to culminate in
Pearl Harbor didn't happen. That wasn't day one of the conflict. Exactly. Right. So like the Russo-Japanese War and the following 35 years before Pearl Harbor happened, like the Japanese were seen in some way as a threat, as a emerging power that has different values than we here in America do. And those values were obviously not perfect by any means, but like it's this idea that they felt threatened from the outside, which is not something that America is particularly good at handling.
No. No, not at all.
But so like that's the entire first 30 years of our story is that's a context that you have to keep in mind. And that's why I'm kind of harping on it a little, but that context you have to keep in mind of like these people that are coming from the other side of the Pacific Ocean, which might as well be another planet, at this time in history, and like bringing different culture to our shores and also, you can't deny the fact that they look different than the people that we're used to, and that's also threatening to the people of the early 20th century.
Well, so I think that's interesting, and also goes to something that's interesting about the Salinas like Chinatown picture, is that there was a Chinese Exclusion Act 30 years before the 1924 Exclusion Act. So the Chinese
Right.
migrant farm workers were aging out and not able to work as farm workers. And so the Japanese were the replacements and not took over, but well, in a couple towns took over, but moved in and became the next generation of workers. And so Chinatowns became Japantowns. But
Okay.
still were kind of seen by outsiders as
I'm sure a lot of people did not
differentiate.
understand the nuance of the difference. Yeah.
Oh,
But
and
this leads
we're
to
having that
the
issue now.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right. But regardless, like all of this leads to exclusion, isolation,
Yeah.
and those people being excluded need to express their own culture in a way that makes them feel, more at home, as much as they can make this their home.
Yep.
Yeah, sumo is something where it's like, young kids gotta hit each other. That's just a universal constant. And if you have a way that is embedded in your culture to do so,
Yeah.
that sumo definitely picks up as a thing that's like, okay, well, things are tough here, but we have our Japanese community and we have our sumo, because that is the sport that is ours.
Yep.
That's kind of how I'm interpreting this chapter of the story.
Yeah, and that is definitely how things kind of start. And so what's interesting is like in the spring of 1926, especially in Fresno, there starts being like coverage of how there's going to be like the Young Men's League is going to have like sumo tournaments. And then it turns out like the newspaper editors of the Nichibei Shimbun, it's the Japanese American newspaper in San Francisco. That's what Nichibei Shimbun means.
Sure.
Starts saying like, oh, and there's going to be a sumo tournament in like Selma, which is in the Central Valley, and Boulder, which is also in the Central Valley of California. And but the biggest one is going to be in Fresno. And so they start like covering this, and there's this like article that I absolutely love. So the other thing is like at this point, they usually refer to these tournaments as taikai. So taikai is tournament. And so if I throw out taikai, that's what it is. So there's going to be a 4th of July tournament. So that's the other thing is like 4th of July, like let's have a big Japanese picnic and sumo tournament on the 4th of July because America.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I like for the first generation people, maybe they think of that as like maybe we can make the white people chill out a little bit.
and like that is a big part of like early identity formation. It's also in opposition to Chinese communities. Like we're not Chinese. There's this like massive like anti-Chinese gambling hall campaign, all kinds of stuff that's happening around the same time as this. We're different from the Chinese. So like, I'm a white person who grew up in Japan. Like there's plenty of racism to go around. Right. So like my people don't have a monopoly on that. So yeah. So
as a fellow white person, no comment.
Yeah. So anyway, this article like starts talking about sumo, and it's in the English language papers, but there's this one that says like, hurry and ride your good old Lizzie or your Lincoln makes no difference, or hit it or anything, just as long as you get to the taikai. And it's this, I don't know, I can't do the 1920s announcer voice, but like
you get an empty paper towel tube and you talk through it like this.
Yeah.
No, I know what you're trying to do.
Yeah, but completely failing. But it's so he's like hyping sumo. They're like, there's like other articles talking like about like what sumo is and how it's different from. Oh, and this is one of the most like cringeworthy ways people talk about like wrestling in general is the grunt and groan.
Oh yeah. Oh god.
Oh, anyway, so it's like there's all these articles that talk about like unlike the grunt and groan you may be familiar with, and I'm like, ooh, just it's cringy. I don't know why. It's like some people hate the word damp or moist. It's like it's kind of that.
No, I think there's layers to that one.
Yeah. So all these articles like talk about this, and they talk about like how there's going to be this like a banner that's like deep royal purple. I have all these details in here, like just in case somebody ever finds this thing, they know what it is. Like, and with like gold trim. Oh, the other thing that plays into this is the Sumo Association in Japan was formed in 1925. So that's
Right,
another
okay.
big thing that we'll talk about a bit more in a future episode that I think does play into this a bit. Is like, hey, there's a Sumo Association in Japan. Let's start organizing more sumo in America, right? So it happens, but it's inspired kind of back and, like not back and forth. It's more the American side's inspired, but like clearly you can see that it's already happening. It's just now like, let's organize it, right?
Yeah, it's a cultural touchstone at this moment that
Yeah.
cool, sumo is evolving in, back in Japan. Makes sense that like, yeah, super awesome. Let's do that here.
Yeah. And so yeah, these articles start showing up all over the place. Talking about sumo. JJ told me not to have a slide that's just full of all kinds of crazy texts and things, but I did it anyway.
But here goes.
We're not gonna read slides.
We're not gonna read them. We're just talking about it.
We're just talking about them. So yeah, in 1926, there start being these tournaments. The town of Bowles wins the Fresno tournament this summer. And so what's interesting is this, like, clearly kind of gets people talking about sumo as something like exciting and let's get it bigger. But then that really accelerates the following year. In the like late 1926 and then going into early 1927, there's a bunch of Northern California clubs that start saying like, hey, let's like not just do a sumo tournament, let's do a league. And one of the things that really inspires that is that in early March of 1927, there's a yokozuna traveling through America on his way from Europe.
Sure.
And so Tochigiyama had just retired as a yokozuna, and he's like traveling through the US, and basically like the Fresno Sumo Association or club and the San Jose Sumo Club like invite him to come up. And so he does, I think there's like kind of a more international connection, but focusing on like how this like really impacted the local community here. Is he comes in and he does like doyo iri, he shows all these ceremonies, he does like he takes on all challengers and just kicks their butts, and so he it's like a big show, and clearly the Northern California sumo clubs are like really excited about this. And so as they start having tournaments throughout the rest of this year, they start going like, hey, there's a tournament in San Francisco, there's a tournament in Fresno, there's a tournament in Sacramento. Like, let's do a league where we're like sending teams to all these tournaments. And so after one of these tournaments, there starts being like a direct conversation about like, let's do this. Like, let's create a league. And they start like creating a format and all this sort of stuff.
I think it's really cool. Sorry, JJ, could you go back one? That Fresno article. I appreciate that the tradition is 100 years old of letting children come up and push you and then hurling them like sacks of potatoes.
Yes. Yeah.
Tochigiyama doing the exact same thing as like Iowa Sumo Club at the Des Moines Cultural Festival every year. Identical. Beautiful. Yep. I love that.
Yep. And that's a thing that I think will just keep coming up in this whole series.
Throwing children.
Well, Well, that too.
It
Actually,
is the best. I
That
can
really is the
attest personally. It's the best part.
yeah. We even have pictures that I need to get reproduced so we can share of our local, like in San Diego, there was a dojo in what's now downtown San Diego, and of like 3 kids wrestling this grown man. And
Oh, sure. Okay.
like,
I
and
love
it's
that.
like 1930 or something. So yeah, I totally need to get that access to that picture and share it. Um, but yeah, like one thing that shows up throughout all of this is the way there's like continuity. Like there's some stuff that just has not changed as part of like how you do sumo demos and sumo like community sumo and all that, and how
Yeah.
you promote sumo. That stuff's kind of the same. And then like the next sentence will be like, whoa, that's different.
Sure.
Yeah.
Some
Um,
sentences that could be from a 1915 or a 2025 article, and then the next sentence completely blows that out of the water.
yeah, it's wild, and it's just this constant like
I love it.
constant process. One of the other things that's like really cool and just interesting, because I'm been into sumo for a while and been interested in Japan my whole life, but because I'm new to amateur sumo, I was reading about these like tournament formats, and I was like, huh. So I mean, you guys might actually be able to tell me more about some of these tournament formats, or our audience in the comments. Is the gonin nuki and the sanin nuki are like huge features of these tournaments, and most of the tournaments are really focused on like team tournaments. They're mostly
Okay.
team tournaments, and then they have the different nuki sections. So team tournaments where every depending on the tournament, it'll be like 5 wrestlers, 3 wrestlers, 8 wrestlers, 12 wrestlers, and they'll go up against so there's some of these where it's like 4 cities sending 12 wrestlers each, and they do like these crazy round robins.
Yeah, I think I saw on the previous page that one of those tournaments was Bowles, California won the tournament, but like there were 6 cities that were competing. It
Yeah.
wasn't individual wrestlers. They referred to 6 cities.
Yep.
So it must have been teams.
Yeah. So it's very like
Yeah, there you go.
yeah, so it's team competitions, and that's a big feature of these early tournaments. And that kind of continues up until World War II. And the other thing to keep in mind is, well, in a future episode, we'll talk, more about, Grand Sumo at the time, but that was kind of similar to how things were running even in Grand Sumo, where it was East versus West. It wasn't just you happened to enter
Sure.
East or West. It's like, no, it was like East and West teams. And that's how it was kind of covered in the press up until like the late 30s. So yeah, that's one thing that's interesting. And then there's the gonin and sanin nuki. So these are like somebody will I think so. I don't know. Are you guys familiar with this format?
I don't know that term.
Okay. So as far as I can tell, because some of the papers will try to explain these, the format is whoever can win 3 or 5 successive matches.
Oh, like a King of the Ring kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a King of the Ring thing, where if you can
Cool.
win 5, that's a gonin nuki. You can defeat 5 in a row, and then a sannin is you can defeat 3 in a row. Yeah, and what was weird is that one of the people I saw explain this is actually somebody who was talking about during World War II in one of the concentration camps when he was a teenager. This guy was talking about how he helped the camp Yakuza boss fix matches
Oh no.
by basically like winning 4 in a row, and then people would like up the bets, and then he'd like lose the last one.
Oh, take a dive right when it's okay.
Yeah. And so like that was one of the ones where I was like, oh, that's how that worked. So yeah, weird stuff.
Like
Yeah.
I mean we've mentioned combat sports and the universality of it a couple times over this episode, but take a dive so that the bets pay off. Oh
yeah.
Every single culture. Like
Yeah.
it's the meme of like all the knights of the round table pointing their sword to the middle of the table, and it's like take a dive so that the bets pay off. Like every single culture, that's the one.
Yeah. There's just all kinds of cool stuff that's interesting about these tournaments. And so I then was like studying or trying to find information about how these formats work. And there's like regional tournaments that happen in Japan and like community sumo where people still do sumo that way, in their like town or region is their, just kind of Matsuri sumo, their festival sumo is they do these formats still. Yeah, so it's really interesting. And then there's like ones where it's like, King of the Ring stuff where it's like an adult that'll take on all the kids coming in. So that's like another format. And that's just for entertainment where like the kids kind of open the ceremony with this like free for all where they try to take on the champion.
Well, like we said, the gimmick for the sumo demo, there's a limited number of choices, so they've been similar for 100 years here.
Yep.
It's kind of awesome how it organically happens too.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, too. Like they're not copying each other. It's just that those are the coolest, funnest, silliest things to do, so they keep popping up.
Yep. Oh yeah. Like, if we've done school demos and like it just comes up where you start being like, everybody wants to take on our biggest guy who has so much fun doing these. And then you start going like, but can 2 of you beat him? Can 3 of you beat him?
Yeah.
And you still just keep adding kids and then it just becomes that. Right.
Yeah. I think it was, I can't remember, but it was one of the Roller Town tournaments in Dallas where we had like, all right, all the kids under 8, come on up to the ring. Let's see if all of you together can beat, I think it was like Justin and Kyle and Caleb or something like that. It's just like everybody charge across the ring, and yeah, demos are timeless. It's the best.
Yep. Yeah. It's really kind of cool. That the way that happens. Yeah. Yeah. So one other thing that's kind of interesting about this is, and it's kind of drives me crazy, is that there's like this 1940 history of the Japanese America that has this like short section on sumo, like 6-7 pages or something like that. And it talks about how there was an American Sumo Association started in LA before this in like 1925. But there's not much coverage I could find in the LA papers at that time. There's one paper I don't have access to yet. I'm working on that. So there might be a bit more. And that LA Sumo Association, at least during this period, is really focused on like exchange programs with Japanese teams. So they're bringing over like Japanese middle schoolers, they're bringing over Japanese university clubs. And it's called the Beikoku Sumo Kyokai, so the American Sumo Association. And so that's formed in LA. It's in Little Tokyo in LA. And they have like a doyo that they built behind their property. We're going to talk about that a bit more in episodes about the second generation and about how like important that like Little Tokyo and LA community and that doyo was. But it's formed here. I just can't find many articles or pictures from this period, but there's references to it.
Sure.
Yeah. So driving me crazy, but
yeah. Another one of those things where it's like, oh, this is just the day-to-day thing. Why would I bother explaining the whole thing?
Yeah. So, yeah. So these things are kind of happening all the way throughout. And then, yeah. So after Tochigiyama comes in July of 1927, it's again, that seems to be like the big tournament. But what's interesting is like Fresno starts really expanding, and Fresno reaches the point where they like are in most of the tournaments are like fielding multiple teams. So there's like a Fresno Young Men's Buddhist Association, YMBA team. And then there'll be like a Fresno YMCA team or YMA. That's the Japanese Christian team. And then there in Sacramento, there's, so this is a picture of that July 4th, 1927. So this is one of the first pictures that I've been able to find. And this is from the Japanese American National Museum. And one of the wildest things about kind of this project overall is that there's these like pictures that show up and there'll be like a little bit of a caption. But when one of the archivists from the Japanese American National Museum, like, I'm looking at all these articles and they have oh yeah, this is the thing I haven't talked about yet. The other thing that's really interesting is that from club to club, it's different. Like Sacramento, like they use shikona, like they use wrestler
Oh,
names
yeah.
almost across the board. And then in Fresno, early on they seem to use shikona, but later it really transitions to them just using a person's last name. And then sometimes you can find their first name. But I'll see all these newspapers and it'll refer to like Asahiyama and Dangoyama and all these, folks in especially Sacramento. And until I got like the picture descriptions from Janum, that's when it's like, oh, names, given names. Because it was like the family of one of these guys. So Yoichi Mori, who is the guy who's in the middle back of this picture holding the flag. It's his descendant, Roy Mori, who's donating this picture, and he says who all these people are. And so, like,
Cool.
just to me, like, ooh, my favorite of all these names is Dangoyama. So, do you guys know what a dango is?
I know what yama is. Yama means mountain, but dango? Isn't that a food?
Yeah, it's the little tiny like mochi.
Oh, like kebabs.
Yeah. So that's is Dangoyama. And he's the guy in the middle, like squatting in the middle, and Sokyo in the middle. So I love that. Like I was like, and now there's a name, like right to Dangoyama. That's Yoshio Shibata. So yeah, it's really cool. So the Sacramento Taikukai is the Sacramento Sumo Club, and that's a picture of them there with a little bit more detail. And they're kind of a powerhouse club between them and Fresno and San Francisco. San Jose early on is, but later San Jose seems to fade a little bit as far as being one of the big clubs. But Fresno, Sacramento, San Francisco, and San Jose are the founding clubs of the Northern California Sumo Association. So
cool.
The Hokka Seinen Sumo Renmei. So the Northern California Young Men Sumo Federation. And then on the right, this is Toyomori Hosokawa, who wrestled under the name Toshuzan. And so one of his first references is in 1928. He's huge in the Sacramento Sumo Club and in one of the tournaments, but then he dies in 1929. He dies young, and this picture was donated to the museum by his family. And there's actually a picture that this is again like all these things that are just out of reach right now that I haven't been able to see yet, but the picture description is of a memorial festivity, festival that the Sacramento club had in honor of Toshuzan, and where Toshuzan's son, who later donated the picture, is being held up as like an infant. So he was a young father.
Great.
Yeah, and so they have the picture in their collection. The wildfires up in LA have made it so that the staff up there are, they've had a lot of disruption, and so they're, like sharing pictures with me online is a low priority. They have other things going on, so I'm not mad at them. It's just just knowing it's out there is something.
Is that Mawashi still? Is it lost to time?
So it's lost to time as far as like I've been able to find so far. But this picture and one other picture that we'll show later are one of the things that really got me going. This could be a big, interesting story. There's a lot of depth to this because this mawashi was donated to him. So I found this in an article by Dr. Azuma. Eiichiro Azuma wrote an article about sumo, and he helped curate an exhibit on sumo at the Japanese American National Museum about 25 years ago. And so he said that this was donated, or the Kesho Mawashi was commissioned by the local, like his Kenjinkai. That's like a prefectural club. People from his prefecture in Japan who were living in that area, they would often have these like kind of fraternal organizations and stuff. So the Kenjinkai donated this, commissioned it. And it was like, there's articles where they talk about it being like in display in a store window before the tournament too in Sacramento. In like a bookstore window, and along with the trophy, the loving cup, which I'm entertained at loving cups, but anyway, trophy. And so this is donated, but the thing that intrigued me so much is that 9 years after this picture was taken in 1938, there's a picture of the Northern California sumo champion and his two attendants, and one of his attendants is wearing the same kishomawashi.
Oh man.
So
there's so much in between there that we kind of have to infer.
Yeah. So, it's one of those things that it's all these things where you can see like, oh, that means like this stuff was being kept. Like Toshuzan's mawashi then became like what, club property, and was, preserved and handed down. And for at least 9 years. And so I don't know what happened to this. Like, I don't know what happened to this. During a later interview, like during an interview we're going to air as kind of a supplement to give kind of context for this, we talked to Brian Nia with Densho, which is an archival and kind of historical preservation organization. And he talks about what happened to a lot of property that belonged to individual families and clubs. And a lot of times they were stored, the community basically before the removal and incarceration during World War II would store it somewhere, whether it was like the community hall of the YMCA or the Buddhist temple, it would be stored somewhere. And
I think he also said that there was government ones too.
Yeah. And sadly, some of these storage places later were victims of arson. Like the San Diego Buddhist temple, there was an arson during World War II. And part of the temple property here at the Buddhist temple of San Diego was burned down. And that included property being lost. And so that happened up and down the state, hate crimes where people were, committing arson. And so, families that were in concentration camps, they lost their, most prized possessions that were stored. Yeah.
Cool. Super, super awesome moment in history for us.
Positive note, right? So unfortunately, like we don't know where some of these are, but the other thing is like sometimes these were recovered. Sometimes these were, preserved by families. And, as family stories get lost and legacies, we don't like, there may be a family holding onto this stuff as prized family possessions, and it is theirs to do with what they want. We would love to be able to see it and, share in the joy because we appreciate it. But, that's just a desire. Like, it's your family story. You can do with it what you want. But it would be cool. It would be really cool if people do have some of these. Because Brian also did mention, this is, going to the concentration camps, future episode, but that there were handmade ones from the camps that were part of like an exhibit, and it was on loan. So it's not in a museum now. It's probably back with a family. But he was like, it exists. So yeah, what happened to these? I don't know.
Like you said, they might just be family heirlooms, and nobody knows, or more importantly, nobody cares that it's important to somebody else's hobby project, right?
Yeah.
Like there's like I don't know, for example, my grandpa is in his 80s and he has piles and piles of I think he upgraded from like reel to reel audio interviews to cassette tapes.
Okay.
But obviously if you're upgrading to cassette tapes, that's minimum 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much you call that an upgrade. Regardless, it's interviews of people from around Minnesota who have interesting like stories. Like the guy in Darwin, Minnesota, who has the biggest ball of twine.
Right.
Great. Cool story. To my grandpa, it was a curiosity. Now
Yeah.
it's a cassette tape that gathers dust.
Yeah.
To someone in the world, someone out there, that 5 to 10 minute interview is gold. That's the thing that they want. And that's like what they're currently researching, and they wish they knew it was out there.
Yep.
If you're currently researching like weird apocryphal rural Minnesota stories, I'm your guy. But on the immense majority chance that you are not, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Like it's just this Kesho Mowashi. Oh, yeah. I mean, my grandpa wore this when he did sumo tournaments in Fresno. Like, who cares about this thing?
Yeah.
So that I don't know. I'm not saying there's any solution to it, but like it's a bummer that it's a bummer that there isn't some form of universal way to reach people to know what is important or what junk is someone else's treasure, you know? So
yeah. And I one of the things I've gained a huge appreciation for through this whole project is like archivists and historical preservation organizations and local historical societies. And it's just, this is a bit, kind of meta, but I've just loved how I'll like fire off an email and a whim to some archivist somewhere saying like, hey, what about this? And, I'll hear crickets for a few weeks because they're busy. And then all of a sudden I'll get this like response and then like catalogs of items. And it just, like breaks things open, and it keeps happening over and over again. And I think the other thing that's kind of heartening for kind of a lot of the archivists and kind of experts we've been talking to about this is that they may not be into sumo, but they appreciate what we're trying to do as far as like telling kind of this cultural story, using it as a way to tell a bigger story, and talk about this important like kind of community and cultural legacy. And so there's people who are like, yep, I have no interest in sumo, but that's cool that you're doing that. Keep doing that. And by the way, here's this like little tiny detail about these people I used to know that I'm like, wait, you knew so-and-so? Like, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of community.
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk about this.
Oh, you haven't showed me this yet. This is incredible.
The design is not great.
I don't care. I don't care. Talk us through it.
Okay. So there were clubs, and I don't even have a little thing for every single club, because from just newspaper articles in this time, I put a little sumo wrestler wherever I knew there was a club. But there's like 3 clubs in little towns right around each other. I think in a later episode, I'll really like spend a little bit of time on like the concentration of where these Nikkei communities are. But this map kind of reflects that. Like there was a big concentration in kind of the Sacramento Valley, a wealthier but small community in San Francisco, big communities in this like Central Valley, especially like Fresno to San Jose, Stockton area, and then big communities in kind of north of Los Angeles, like Burbank, and then east of LA in the San Gabriel Valley, and then in Orange County and San Pedro, which is the port of Los Angeles, and then down here in San Diego. And weird artifact, Tijuana had a sumo club, and it was spelled like Tia, like aunt in Spanish, and Juana like Jane. So I put a little one down on Tijuana, so it's not like how it's spelled now with Tijuana.
Yeah, half credit.
Yeah, so it was Tijuana. And so there was a Tijuana club, a San Diego club, and like San Pedro and Burbank and LA, Glendale. And then up in the Central Valley, there were clubs in Fresno, San Jose, San Francisco, Sacramento. And then there were a bunch of smaller clubs, like we talked about, Bowls. And later by the late 30s, there's clubs in like Cortland, Ileton, all these towns up and down the Sacramento and Central Valley, like San Joaquin and Delta, Central Valley. And then there were tournaments, regular tournaments happening in like San Francisco had a tournament, and it was a pretty big tournament in the late 20s. But it seems like it really becomes like a Fresno Sacramento rotation, kind of back and forth mainly, and San Jose early on, but then a little bit less later. So the main tournaments in Northern California are Sacramento and Fresno. So I put the little Goombay there, the fan, and then in LA was totally the center of sumo in Southern California. All the tournaments were happening. The big tournaments were happening at the doyo in Little Tokyo. And then there were like picnics. I just put like this onigiri all over the place where there were picnic references. So like Salinas Valley down in Bakersfield, Imperial Valley, San Diego.
To the importance of the picnic?
Yeah. So these like, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but these like picnics, there's tons of references to sumo happening at just picnics. So there's like the local Japanese association would have a picnic. A Japanese like Navy training ship would come into town. There'd be a picnic and a like a sumo tournament. There would be different like Kenjinkai, the prefectural association. Like in San Diego, the Wakayama Kenjinkai was the big one down here. Because, sorry, this is going back into interesting things. So within the Issei communities, there were kind of 4 areas where people really came from for the most part. Like to Hawaii, a lot of people from Okinawa, but to the mainland, a lot of people came from Kumamoto, Wakayama, and then a bit from Kanagawa, like Yokohama area, and then also up in like near Sendai, in like Tohoku, northeastern Japan. But like Wakayama and Kumamoto and Hiroshima. Sorry, I forgot about Hiroshima. Hiroshima was also a big area where a lot of people came over. And it's just like weird vagaries of like where contract worker hiring was happening, like, and where there was like, a famine in the, 19 teens. So a lot of people were out of work. And, but then what's interesting is like kind of upper class, like ex-samurai often would come from different areas, whereas the poorer folks would come from, different regions. Anyway, yeah, go ahead, Jake.
I don't have anything meaningful to add, but I do have to say, as somebody who has looked at many maps of the Mojave Desert, I'm a little bit disappointed that Fallout 4 did not feature any early 20th century sumo references. So, or excuse me. Oh my gosh. Oh man, I outed myself there. Fallout New Vegas.
Thank you.
Not Fallout 4. Fallout 4 is
Fallout 4 is
for the one that's in West Virginia.
No, it's
Fallout 4 is in Boston.
Boston.
Fallout 76 is it? Yeah, whatever. New Vegas did not.
Come on now.
This shows how behind I am on Fallout, where I'm like, Klamath? Isn't that where it's happening? Like Northern California, Southern Oregon? Isn't that where Fallout's set?
Oh, man.
Isn't that like
Nathan?
It's sprawled since then?
Nathan's talking about a good game. You messed up and said Fallout 4, which is not that good of a game.
Fallout 4 is perfectly fine, but New Vegas is obviously the one that's like, that's the one.
That's the new.
They should just remake New Vegas. I'm sorry, we digress. This can be a different.
Don't apologize for being correct. Fallout. Like, go ahead, Nathan.
I'm just imagining a context in which you're like rummaging through apocalyptic landscapes and you find a mawashi and that's like an upgrade. I'll shed all this armor and my minigun and flamethrower and I'll just put on a mawashi.
It's Fallout.
Dumber things.
Like, it's not above satire. Like you got to have like, if you're wearing this particular belt on your equipment, you should have the ability to just palm a guy in the face for a 5% chance to knock him out. Whatever. It doesn't matter.
And then you can target where you're at.
Yeah.
Oh. All right, JJ. I know what our next episode has to be about, but
yes,
we should probably move on for this because. Honestly, just me seeing the Mojave Desert on that map was kind of the only segue for this. So go ahead, Nathan. What did we have next?
So I just wanted to kind of like paint a picture of like how, and I had I think, it's self-explanatory on the map. You don't need to bring it back up, but I had the little, a cherry blossom, Kyokai logo there to kind of show that there was like a Northern California and a Southern California Sumo Association. And like initially there was like an attempt to have like a Central California and a Northern California, but they ended up just merging. Like, and so there's a Northern California Sumo Association. Later, there's
like
drama
at the
with
same,
the kids.
like at a similar time, Osaka and Tokyo.
Yes.
I wonder
Yep.
if that was a factor in their decision making.
I don't know, but when we get to like the transition from the Issei to the Nisei, there's like definitely like these Issei writers talking about like sumo clubs and like how the kids tried to form breakaway clubs, but then the tournaments were a disaster. It's hilarious because it's like
Kids these days.
Yeah, exactly. Kids these days stuff, and it's like it's hilarious. So I think that might even be what we decide to call that episode is Kids These Days, because there's so much Kids These Days stuff like in those stories. It's hilarious.
Oh man,
these like, you know, guys in their 50s and 60s, sumo in our day. It's really funny.
Just because we've already established it as a pattern, let me shout out Hardcore History one more time. But in Hardcore Histories, JJ is like, hell yeah, I don't care how many times, just keep shouting them out.
Plugging it.
It's my favorite podcast.
Oh God, it's the best. I just wish you put out more than one episode a year.
Handle more.
Yeah. But in his series on the Roman Republic, he shouts out every single generation going back to like literally Caesar. Every generation is like, these kids don't know what the hell they're doing. These kids are the worst. Yeah. They're going to ruin everything.
Yep. And I like desperately try to keep that in mind, that people
so hard
been saying that. And, you know, especially now that I'm like, you know, I manage people. I'm like, okay, all right. Like we've always been saying that. Like,
but have you seen the kids these days? Oh my God.
I know, exactly. And then like, I like the kids. I like the kids. I'm okay with the kids. You know?
Every generation in human history has said that the kids are going to be a disaster, and they all turn out fine.
Yeah.
But this generation, though,
yep.
they got the TikTok and the brain rot, and it's a done deal. Well, humanity's over.
They'll turn out all right. I was a disaster when I was a kid. Like,
of course they will, but it's so hard to like.
I know, keep that
in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
So on that note, actually that is a good segue, because in this story, I cut the 1920s and the first generation in it ends in 1928. The 20s end in 1928 because by early 1929, there's these like articles about sumo tournaments happening where people start going like, wait, 75% of these are kids, like they're Nisei, like they're second generation. And they start realizing that like it's the kids. And so like the first tournament where you start seeing this, and I'll spend a little bit more time in it in a future episode, but there's a tournament where I'm looking at the tournament results and a breakdown. And they have these like A and B classes, and A are like older, bigger, more experienced. And then B are, you know, it's the B team, right? And there's the tournament where the B team beats the A team. And you can tell there's like the B team beat the A team. And
hold on. Yeah. Pump the brakes.
And as a person who started sumo in middle age, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what it's like when you wrestle people a third or half my age. Like they're going to kick my butt. Like that's what's going to happen. And so immediately I was like, oh yeah, okay, that checks out. And
I get it.
Yeah. And then the articles, you know, start going like, oh, wow, it's kids doing sumo mostly. So in 1929, like I swear after New Year's, all of a sudden it's the kids. One other shout out, we did a shout out to Hawaii, but there's another important shout out. Is I call it damp sumo on this slide, but you'll notice all these pictures are indoors. And that's because as a person who lived in the Pacific Northwest for a long time, yeah, this is Seattle, Tacoma, Portland. Okay. Yeah, you're going to do sumo indoors. Because as it is in Northern California, there's all these like stories of we had a tournament planned, but we had to postpone it because the doyo got rained out. Imagine what that would be like in like Seattle.
Yeah, I mean, similar issue. We do not do outdoor tournaments in the Midwest. It does not happen.
No. Yeah. So, indoor sumo. So I think there could be at least a whole episode. I haven't dug enough in the Pacific Northwest. I'm having chats with like Rain City up there, and there's folks up in Rain City that are really interested in looking at the history of sumo up in the Pacific Northwest. So I don't want to step on their toes, but there's another big shout out to like it was big in the Pacific Northwest too.
Sure.
And so like I don't want to disrespect that, but yeah, there's additional stories there, and hopefully we can work together to tell cool stories of Pacific Northwest sumo. Yeah. So
Awesome.
yeah.
Nathan, we've
Yeah.
got to a pretty good spot. Is there anything that you want to wrap it up with?
I don't think so. Yeah. The local, historical society, I really appreciate their kind of inspiring us to tell this story here in San Diego. It was, one of the members of their board pointing out that foot like kind of stuck in JJ's mouth that really got this project going. And our kind of excitement to kind of connect with our local community and its kind of cultural heritage, the Nikkei community here is what kind of inspired this. And they have pictures in their collection, they have items in their collection that are from a later period, but it's really that inspired this whole thing to dig deeper. And we keep finding all kinds of stuff and especially as a history nerd, like the fantasy I think of a lot of like really obsessive history nerds is to find a topic where there's like one person or nobody who's really dug into it. And this one, there's like one person who
Yeah.
wrote an article 25 years ago. So a lot of these
Wow.
articles that are
They
sitting
didn't
there,
even start a podcast. Pathetic.
well, and so like the idea that like this is stuff that people haven't looked at and is really exciting. Like
For sure. Yeah.
we're having a chance to kind of tell this story, and with I hope humility of saying other people are going to do it better in the future, and I'm cool with that. So we're just starting the process, and I'm okay with that.
I'd love to be a source for somebody, like being listed in the bibliography for a greater project is absolutely something that I think all of us would be perfectly happy with.
Yep.
100%.
Real quick, just in case anybody skipped episode 0, JJ, we've referenced the foot and mouth twice now on this episode. Can you give us like the 30-second version on what we're talking about? Because it's a little bit fundamental to this show and like why you started this idea. But just like I said, just in case anybody skipped episode 0, where we talk about our personal motivations and the general gist of the whole story, where did that come from?
So I ran a tournament, and I like to think of myself as a promoter sometimes. And I started talking about the first ever sumo tournament in San Diego, which was definitely a lie.
And you said this in like what, 22, 23?
This was 22. So, who would have thought 100 years ago
Yeah.
there was a sumo tournament in San Diego?
Yep. Well, and the San Diego sumo team like won the Southern California Championships in around the late 20s. Like they were really good. So yeah, it's
So I was lying.
Yep.
Yeah, it looks here.
You weren't lying. You were mistaken. It was honest. Like you didn't know.
1928 and 1929, San Diego.
Yep. Yep. So yeah, San Diego did really well in that era. Yeah.
So yes. What was it? Was it AT? Is that who was like who pulled you aside and was like, you weren't quite accurate there. Let me help you out with a little bit. Yeah.
I love the way AT like just pulled me aside and it's like, hey, sensei, there was tournaments before, just so you know, and I was, oh man, if I could show my emotions on my face, I was probably red and purple. I stopped breathing for a second. I was like, because the last thing I want to do is, like neglect the past, because it's so huge. And then, which then made us dive in and just try to figure this out. And again, I always point to you guys on these podcasts, and I'm like, I'm very fortunate, right? And Nathan is you just like send him in a direction, and if it latches, he'll just keep going. He'll just keep going, and he'll go rogue. He'll go real rogue.
Well,
like
totally go rogue.
he found out the history of sumo in the United States. I was just looking for San Diego.
Yeah. Well, and I had to like JJ and I were talking about this the other day. I was like, wait, I've kind of lost the thread. Like it kind of started with this local inspiration, and like, we still gotta like kind of recognize that. And that's
now I'm making a map of where the sumo clubs in Fresno were meeting.
Yeah, well, and I am like, as I'm taking notes from these articles, I am literally writing like, oh, it's behind this boot shop, like the something bootery, and which I just love bootery as a word. But
That's
anyway,
a good word.
Isn't it though? So yeah, like I'm looking at this stuff. I'm nerding out on maps of Little Tokyo in like the 1930s in LA, like all this sort of stuff that's really kind of like deep dive, cool stories. And I'm grateful that when I joined the club, JJ and Christina kind of talked about that experience and how they wanted to kind of honor that in our upcoming tournament, the SoCal Open, last weekend in February every year. And they wanted to kind of honor that history and kind of the traditions and pageantry of sumo. I was like, yeah, this is cool. Like I'm for that. I like telling those, being part of those stories and telling those stories. So, yeah, that was really neat. And Jake, I don't think I had a chance to say this in our kind of episode 0 where we talk about it a little bit more, but I really appreciate that, you're bringing this curiosity to this, to history, but also, like that a lot of people who do like sumo and grand sumo podcasts and coverage, I don't know about dismissive of amateur sumo or international sumo, but I appreciate that you see it as valid. And for me,
I am the furthest from that. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. and one of the things I really love, and I think this, I don't think it's just confirmation bias with this project, is that international sumo, amateur sumo has been going on longer than grand sumo. Like this stuff existed before the Japan Sumo Association. It was happening all over Japan, and people from all over Japan brought sumo to America, like with no relationship necessarily to grand sumo. And like, this is as real sumo as grand sumo. Like it's.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different comparisons you could make, but like, I don't know, maybe one version of it would be like saying, me personally, I'm a fan of pro wrestling.
Yeah.
And somebody else being like, yeah, well, what if the WWE is only doing this? And I'm like, that's not the only professional wrestling. There's like, there's an entire sport, there's an entire history and culture and all that stuff. And like, I mean, yes, I am definitely, at least of like my cohort on Grand Sumo Breakdown, I'm by far the most interested in the non top layer Grand Sumo. I'm certainly interested in that. But yeah, the history of this is like so multi-layered, so interesting, so important, so tied into other things that especially as Americans that have frankly questionable history education, this is fascinating to me, and I hope that everybody listening to this has curiosity and interest in history, and goes and listens to Hardcore History, the podcast by Dan Carlin, because it's incredible.
Not a sponsor, by the way, or anything, but just keep coming up.
I just hope that check from Dan Carlin clears here. We'll see what happens, but
you can purchase Wrath of Khan on podcasts on iTunes, please.
As a Hardcore History more than enthusiast, I will tell you it's technically the Wrath of the Khans, and there are 5 parts to it. So
I know. It's so good. It's like 16 hours of my life. There's no way that we'll approach that because we have jobs. But I hope that we can be a similar
level of resource to people interested in this niche of history.
Yeah,
So,
it's a
yeah,
niche, but it's telling a bigger story, which is cool. Really quick, just complete squirrel, just as you were talking about, like, because I live in San Diego and it's like Comic-Con happens here, I've just always been so entertained by the whole my obscure nerd hobby is empirically superior to your obscure nerd hobby
I
thing
will,
that
and I will
happens.
fight you for it. Yeah.
And I'll fight you for it. I'm like, okay, like I really am a like it's our obscure like it. And one thing I like about the amateur sumo community is people are like it's sumo. Like it's not like better. It just is sumo. Like
Yeah.
that's it. You know, it is not the complete system that will defeat your complete system or whatever. It's like it's just
Yeah.
sumo. Like
That
we love it.
and if I was recording this in my basement and instead of this much sumo stuff behind me, there's literally just this much Incredible Hulk stuff behind me. And yes, I would fight you if you
Yeah.
picked a different favorite superhero. I'd do it. I would full on go fisticuffs. However, sumo, no, sumo's all love. You know what? Whatever. Sumo's great. We all love it.
Yeah.
That's one thing. But yes, if it does come to Comic-Con, Nathan, we might fight.
Oh, and that reminds me. Yeah, no, it can wait till after. Well, it can wait.
We will
It can wait.
talk about that at a different time.
We can
but,
talk about that at a different time.
I think that I will go ahead and wrap this up. This has been an awesome journey through the past. And again, it seems that the past sometimes lies in our future. So study your history, dive deep, and let's try not to let it repeat.
Yeah.
John, that.
Hi, I'll do that.
Hardcore.